In Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, after creating the first human being, God announces it is not good for the man to be alone. Up to this time, everything that God had created, God had said, that's good, that's good, that's good. This is the first time God says something's not good. It's not good for the man to be alone. Now, despite all of the ways that technology connects us, we can travel across the country and around the world. We can talk to people with FaceTime or Skype who are all over the place. We can go into social media and find out in an instant what people are doing and up to and where they are. Despite all of these different ways that technology connects us, we are actually today facing an epidemic of loneliness that has far-reaching consequences for our emotional, our physical, and our spiritual health and well-being. Now, what is loneliness? Loneliness is the painful recognition or perception that we lack close, meaningful relationships. It is the painful recognition or perception that we lack close, meaningful relationships. And recent studies have demonstrated that 1 in 5 Americans suffers from persistent loneliness. This isn't just the occasional moment when you feel lonely or disconnected. This is a persistent, chronic sense. And lonely people are found in absolutely every age group. There is no age group, there is no subculture that is immune from that. There are lonely children. There are lonely teenagers and young adults. There are lonely middle-aged people who are at kind of the height of their productivity. There are lonely seniors. Now, everyone feels lonely from time to time, for sure. But for some people, loneliness is a chronic condition, and it has reached epidemic proportions, and not just in our own culture, but in others as well. In an article in Forbes magazine, Carolyn Beaton made an observation that, frankly, I was really surprised by. She says, mysteriously, loneliness appears most prevalent among, which age group would you think? Loneliness appears most prevalent, according to this Forbes article, among millennials. This is a group of young adults who were born between 1980 and 2000. And in this article, she's trying to tease out why is it among that age group in particular that they're feeling so lonely. And she comes up with 2 explanations. The first one, she says, is that loneliness is contagious. And here's how it works. If you're lonely, you sort of transmit loneliness to others, which undermines the relational ties that you share. And when somebody has been affected by our loneliness and the way we're dealing with our loneliness, they oftentimes wonder, gosh, is it something that I'm doing? It makes them feel lonely. And what follows is this cascade of loneliness as we just pass it on from one person to another. This is especially prevalent among millennials. The other issue that she identifies is the internet and social media. The internet and social media actually contribute to our loneliness, which is really ironic because so many people turn to social media in order to alleviate their loneliness and feel a sense of connection. But it turns out that social media may actually make matters worse, because while it gives the illusion of connection, all that carefully curated information that people are posting on social media is just a partial and more likely than not, mostly, it is carefully curated, so it's mostly positive picture of what's really going on in other folks' lives. And so rather than connecting us, it actually disconnects us. Plus, time on social media, and go to any restaurant, and it's amazing. You'll see people sitting together, and they're not talking to each other. They're looking at their phones. Time on social media is time that we could otherwise invest in face-to-face relationships. I remember one of our elders was on vacation a number of years ago. He and his wife and family, a group of friends, were in Hawaii, this beautiful place, and they had this wonderful place where they were staying and all this kind of stuff. And he posted a picture of Facebook, and it's a picture of everybody in the group sitting around in this condo in Hawaii looking at their phones. So I think a really important first step in facing down the fear or facing down the experience of loneliness is recognizing that loneliness really is a serious problem. It's a really serious problem. In fact, science has discovered that loneliness, chronic loneliness, can actually be fatal. It is as potent a cause of death as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It is twice as deadly as obesity. I'm not talking about being a little overweight. I'm talking about obesity. Chronic loneliness has an incredible impact, not only in our emotional health, depression and all that, our spiritual health. It also has an incredible impact on our physical health. It increases the production of stress hormones, so we just feel tense all of the time. It raises our blood pressure, reduces the flow of blood to our vital organs. It affects the production of our white blood cells. It impairs our immune system's ability to fight off infections. Chronically lonely adults consume more alcohol, they get less sleep, they get less exercise, they have far more fat in their diets, they are more likely to be obese, they are more likely to suffer cognitive decline and even dementia. That's what loneliness does. Loneliness is a serious problem. Which is why God had it absolutely right in that opening chapter, those opening chapters of the Bible, the book of Genesis. It is not good for us. On so many levels, it is not good for any of us to be alone. Now, don't get me wrong. Having a little alone time, great thing, right? I mean, if you're a single mom or if somebody that is in the workforce and you've got all these demands on your time and responsibilities, it is great to get away from time to time and just enjoy being by yourself. Having a little alone time is great, but chronic loneliness is painful to the point of being fatal. So what can we do about that? How can we help ourselves and one another? How do we address the fear? How do we address the reality of loneliness in our lives? Well, I think a great way to begin when we're feeling lonely, and especially when this loneliness becomes a pattern for us, a really great place to start is recognizing that there's some bad ways to deal with loneliness and refusing to make dumb or self-destructive decisions when I'm alone. You know that some of our most common reactions to loneliness, rather than addressing the problem, actually serves to make matters worse. It actually makes us more lonely rather than less. One of those self-destructive choices, and it is so common, and it's so easy to do this, one of those self-destructive choices is withdrawing from other people when you actually need them the most. Now, some researchers have suggested that social isolation or withdrawing from other people might be a bigger problem for guys than it is for women. I can't say, I don't like to generalize about women are this way, men are this way, and all that. I'm sure there's, some women who are this way, some guys that are that way. But in general, this is what folks say. I don't know if that's true or not. What I do know is this, that there is a guy in the Old Testament who is a perfect example of someone who, when they are feeling isolated and alone, decides to withdraw from others. He happens to be this guy named Job. And Job, you'll remember, he loses his wealth. He loses his family. His relationship with his wife is undermined because her advice to him is just curse God and die. He's got these friends who, see him in his pain, and rather than come alongside him to comfort him, to encourage him, they start coming up with all the reasons why he's going through this. Well, it must have been something that you've done. It leads Job just to withdraw. He says, I despise my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone, he said. Just leave me alone. My days have no meaning. You can tell he is depressed, and you can tell the way that he's dealing with it is just withdrawing from other people. He's another great example of another dumb and closely related, I think, self-destructive choice that we can make when we are feeling alone, and that is to throw a pity party and feel sorry for ourselves. You ever done that? When we withdraw into self-pity, it makes matters worse. And this has been studied as well. It creates what somebody's referred to as a gloomy feedback cycle. Isn't that a great term? Gloomy feedback cycle, where we think, when we're feeling lonely, we think that other people don't like us. And when we feel that other people don't like us, we sort of withdraw physically and emotionally, which makes them feel uncomfortable, leads them to conclude that we don't like them, which causes them to withdraw. And we sense that they're withdrawing, and you go, see, nobody likes me. A gloomy feedback cycle. It's what happens when we throw a pity party. It's a dumb choice. A third dumb, self-destructive decision we make is just refusing to reach out and admit that we need help. Ask for help from other people. And oftentimes people will do that because they assume that other people know what they're going through. If they really love me, they'd see that I'm feeling lonely. We assume that other people know what we're going through when, in fact, they don't have any idea because we've never told them. They just might sense that something's wrong, or we're feeling weird, or they don't know. They don't have any idea because we haven't told them, or we just assume, well, if they really loved us, they would know. And that's more pity party stuff. Now, in addition to some of these sort of relational and psychological dumb things that we do when we experience loneliness, there's spiritually dumb things we do too. Spiritually dumb. And these spiritually dumb things just serve to contribute to even more loneliness. I'll tell you what, one of the spiritually dumb things that almost every one of us does, we refuse to forgive when others have hurt us. Now, I get it. We all know how hard forgiveness is because you cannot forgive another person. Forgiveness doesn't exist unless there has been a real hurt or injury. So I get it. It is hard when you've been injured by someone, whether they did it intentionally or unintentionally. It is hard to let go of that. But what we may not realize is how important forgiveness is to our emotional and our physical and our social and our spiritual well-being. Because without forgiveness, we just can't live together. We cannot live together. In a fallen world, it is guaranteed we are going to misunderstand one another. We are all going to be motivated to one extent or another by self-interest, and sometimes self-interest conflicts with another person's self-interest. If we cannot find it within ourselves to forgive someone who has trespassed against us, and if other people can't find it in their hearts to forgive us when we intentionally or unintentionally, knowingly or unknowingly, have maybe hurt them, we will find ourselves, every one of us will find ourselves more and more isolated and alone. We'll start out with a world full of friends. And if we can't forgive people when they hurt us, that circle of friends will shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink until it's us. You've got to forgive. A marriage is not going to survive without forgiveness. Families can't survive without forgiveness. Friendships can't survive without forgiveness. Not only will we find ourselves more and more and more isolated and alone if we refuse to forgive, we will find ourselves at odds with God. And this is why this is a spiritual thing. Because God has forgiven us. And what does God ask of us in response to that forgiveness? To forgive others. What do we pray in the Lord's Prayer? Forgive us our trespasses. Forgive us, God, our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. That's God's will for our lives. There are lots of other dumb things we do. One other one I'll just touch on briefly is a fifth really dumb, self-destructive decision we can make when we are feeling sort of a chronic sense of loneliness is getting involved in unhealthy relationships. That's the thing about loneliness. Somebody who's been there has said, it makes us run into the arms of people we really shouldn't be with. It's like that old country song from way back when, looking for love in all the wrong places. You know, and why is it that we do that? Why is it that people, have serial unhealthy relationships? Why is it that another dumb thing that we can do is get involved in addictive behaviors, whether it's alcohol or drugs or sexual addiction or whatever, pornography? Why do people fall into those kinds of patterns as a response to loneliness? It's a really interesting story in the Gospel of John, really near the front end of the Gospel of John. In this story, Jesus is in Samaria, and the Samaritans were enemies longtime enemies of the people of Israel. They worshiped in different places. They had different practices. They were really closely related, but you know how closely related people can be, the worst of enemies. Jesus is in Samaria. His disciples have gone off to do something or other, and Jesus happens to meet a woman who has come to draw water from a well. Now, this is really unusual, and it's unusual for a couple of reasons. One is because Jewish men would never be found alone with a woman to whom they were not married. That's one strange thing. And another strange thing is that women would never go alone to wells to draw water. They would go along with other women. It's where, they shared the news of the day and talked about, what their kids are doing and all that stuff. It was a place of social gathering, not just a place to get water. So here's Jesus, and here's this woman, and they both find themselves in this kind of odd situation, but it gives them an opportunity to talk. And Jesus asks this woman for some water. And his request for a little bit of water leads to this kind of extensive conversation. It's one of the longest conversations recorded between Jesus and another person. This long conversation that covers a bunch of topics, a relationship between the Jewish and the Samaritan people and how and where they worship. They get into this conversation that you can sense there's some symbolic stuff behind it. They talk about water, and Jesus talks about living water. And finally, the conversation, finally rolls around to this woman's unconventional marital status. It turns out, and, Jesus sort of prophetically shares this with her. He says that she's been married 5 times, and she's now living with a man who isn't her husband. Might explain why she's there by herself and not with the other women in the community. And what's the connection between, this woman's unconventional marital status and this conversation between water and living water and what makes it different and all that? You drink water from the well where Jesus and the Samaritan woman are talking, and you get thirsty again. You have to keep coming back to that well. But Jesus tells her, whoever drinks the water that I give them will never be thirsty again. He's talking about something that God, through Jesus, gives us that breaks this pattern of having to keep doing these habitual things over and over again. Blaise Pascal, great Christian French philosopher, said that he's the first one who said that there is this God-shaped space in every human heart that we try to fill with the things of this world. Whenever we try to fill that God-shaped space with the things of this world, it is never enough. That's the cause of all of these longings that we have that never seem to be satisfied. There's a God-shaped space that nothing in this world can fill. And it's very much related to something Augustine said many centuries before when he says that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. Trying to alleviate loneliness, trying to alleviate chronic loneliness with unhealthy relationships is a dumb idea. And it doesn't work because we are trying to fill this God-shaped space with something that will never satisfy us. Trying to fill the God-shaped space with alcohol or drugs or pornography or working ourselves to death won't work. So as you kind of look back at it, withdrawing from other people, throwing a pity party, feeling sorry for ourselves, refusing to ask for help when we need it, trying to alleviate loneliness through unhealthy relationships or other addictive behaviors, they're self-destructive and they just don't work. So the question is, what do I do? How do we address the problem of chronic loneliness? What do I do when I feel alone? And really, the Bible offers us a clear and a compelling and a time-tested response to that question. You rebuild your life on God and on God's promises and God's provision, because God has provided for you what you need. He's provided healthy responses and answers to your life's deepest longings. Now, question that I haven't looked at yet, and I think it's important, and what I'm about to say might be a bit surprising. The question is, gosh, if God made us the way we are, why do we feel loneliness when it's so painful? Well, there is a biblical, God-given reason for our loneliness. And interestingly, and I will add, not surprisingly, science agrees with what the Bible teaches. I think all truth comes from God. Biblical truth comes from God. Scientific truth comes from God. And both the Bible and science are agreed on the purpose of loneliness in our lives. Loneliness is what is called an aversive signal. Now, what does that mean? It's an aversive signal like hunger or like thirst or like pain. It is a signal that an essential life-sustaining need isn't being met in your life. Example, hunger is a signal that you need food. Your body's telling you you need nourishment. Thirst is an aversive signal. That is your body telling you you need some water, you need something to drink. Pain is an aversive signal that is telling you you need to pay attention to something in your physical body. There's a problem that you need to address. Loneliness is an aversive signal. Loneliness is a signal that an essential need in your life isn't being met. And that need is a need for love and belonging. That's why we feel loneliness. That's why God made us the way He made us. Now, the good news is that loneliness, even those for people who have suffered from chronic loneliness up to this point, loneliness is actually a mutable psychological state. It is, in other words, it can be a temporary state if you make the right choices. It doesn't have to be permanent. And indeed, it shouldn't be permanent. God says it's not good for us to be alone. Now, to be fair, God does some of His best work in the lives of people who have been alone. And you look in the Bible and you can think of people like Abraham, who had to make this, even though he was going with his son Isaac, he was on a lonely path as God was working in his life. Think of people like Joseph sitting in a prison cell, thrown into a pit by his jealous brothers. Think of Moses, who is out in the wilderness as a fugitive from murder in Egypt. Think of David, who's being hunted down by King Saul, or Elijah, who's hiding in a cave because his enemies are out to get him. God does some of His best work in the lives of people who are alone for a season, but He always sends them back into the world, because in the long run, it is not good for us to be alone. We were created by God to be loved. And we were created by God to love God and to love other people. And loneliness is a signal that that's not happening. It's a reminder that we were created for relationship and community, and life will never feel right unless and until we get reconnected with others. What's the first and great commandment? You remember when Jesus is asked by a lawyer, what is the first and great commandment? It's kind of a test, and Jesus quotes from the Hebrew Scriptures. The first and great commandment is this: you shall love. It's love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And a second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We were created for community. We're created to be in relationship with God, and we were created for community. And rather than suffer through the pain of chronic loneliness, God has created a beautiful community for us in the family of faith, in the body of Christ, in the church that Jesus Christ built and the church that Jesus Christ is building today. The fact that we are together here this morning, it says a lot about you and the healthy choice that you're making in terms of addressing potential problem of loneliness, because we're connected to God. We're connected with one another. What we're talking about here is real. It's not pretend. It's not posing or posturing. It's not posting curated stuff on Facebook. It's talking about real stuff. A lot of people have described the church as being a really great place for families. This is a church for families, and we've actually done some advertising like that because we were really interested in helping parents and grandparents raise their kids to have healthy values and to know and love God and to know how to serve other people and to care and to grow up to be healthy and mature. But you know what? The church isn't just for families. The church is a family. And as a matter of fact, the church is a family for people who don't have a family. You don't have to be alone. And people that you know who are living isolated lives and suffering from chronic loneliness, they don't have to be alone. This is why I am so passionate about encouraging you guys to invite people you know and you love to be a part of the church, because it is going to be a blessing to them. Once again, I think this is the sixth week in a row. We're going to be circling back. All three of the pastors have talked about the three core values that we have here at Stonebridge Community Church. What are they? Worship, group or community life, and serving God and others. Why is worship so important? Worship is where we connect and celebrate our relationship with God, and we don't do it alone. It's not like I'm worshiping God in nature. People say, oh, I don't have to go to church. I worship God in nature. Well, you can worship God in nature, but you cannot worship God with God's people the way that God has actually set it up in Scripture without being a part of a church family. Group life, community life. Why do we have growth groups? Group life is where we connect and celebrate our relationship with God's family. And again, I'm really passionate about this. If you are not in a growth group, you are missing out on one of the most important gifts that God has to give you. And if you're so selfish to think, I don't need to be in a growth group, it's not about you. It's not all about you. You could be a blessing to other people by being in a growth group. And for those dear folks that we have who are part of Stonebridge Community Church, who for whatever reason, because of age or physical disability or whatever it is, who can't make it here to church, they're still a part of our church family. And it's why we have Stephen ministers. It's why we have deacons. It's why we have a congregational care team. It's why we have loving folks who aren't a part of any particular team, but just have a heart for folks who are by themselves. And they go out there week after week after week just to love people. They can't come here, we'll go there. There are over 5 dozen commandments, crystal clear commandments in the New Testament, these one another commandments that we just flat out ignore or we flat out disobey if we try to live out our faith in isolation, cut off from the church. It says, love one another, pray for one another, encourage one another, support one another. It calls us to challenge one another and a whole bunch of other stuff. We can't do that. We can't show God's love. We can't be Christ to one another if we're trying to live lives by ourselves. And then our third core value, service. Serving God and other people. One of the best ways that we can serve God and others is by being on the lookout for lonely people. And by that, the way, it's not that hard to find them. You know them. Right now, I bet if I just ask you to write down the names of some lonely people you'd immediately think of some people. And those are all people that we can show an interest in and care for. People who need to know. They need to know this because it is not good for us to be alone. They need to know they aren't alone. They need to know that they matter to us, that their lives matter, that there's a reason that they are here, and that they have a place in our hearts and in our church and in our lives. A number of years ago, I think it was maybe 10 years or so ago, I'm not sure about that exactly, there was recognizing that there was this epidemic of loneliness sweeping their nation. A number of organizations, a number of individuals who were really passionate about this in the UK got together to launch a nationwide initiative called the Campaign to End Loneliness. And if you go to the UK, you will find posters all over the place of a lonely senior who's looking out their window. And underneath, it'll talk about the campaign to end loneliness and what you can do to help. This campaign to end loneliness has become such a big movement that the National Health Service in the UK has actually partnered with it because they see the epidemic of loneliness as being a public health issue. And it is. We saw that. We saw how loneliness can kill people. I believe that the church of Jesus Christ, I believe Stonebridge Community Church, and each one of us as a part of it, is called to the same vision. We're called to a campaign to end loneliness. And I think one of the best ways that if you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling sad, discouraged, the best way to address the inner loneliness that we all feel from time to time is by looking up to God, thanking Him for the relationship that we have with Him, thanking God for our church, and then looking out in love for people who are alone. It is not good for us to be alone. So when you feel alone, acknowledge your need for a relationship with God and other people. Be willing to reach out and ask for help. Don't withdraw. It's the last thing you need to do. Don't make it a test if people are going to notice if you're lonely or not, because they're living their own lives. And they may love you, and they would rush to you in a moment if you just spoke up and said something. Get in a growth group. If you're struggling with some stuff and you need a spiritual friend, talk to one of us on the staff about a Stephen minister, or about somebody from congregational care stopping by. Avoid withdrawing into loneliness. And by the way, really, I'm just pleading with you guys, avoid at all costs getting drawn into the drama of dumb, self-destructive relationships that are just going to make you lonelier in the end. I want to encourage all of us, let go of old grievances and learn to forgive, because if you cannot do that, you will find your circle of friends diminishing to nothingness. And make new friends. And how do you do that? You want friends? Be a friend. Remember that the life you're living and what you're feeling and the needs that you have, they're the same needs. They're shared by everybody else. Be on the lookout for opportunities to volunteer and to serve and to care, especially for those whom you sense are alone. And I want to go back to, that idea of writing down the names of people that you know who are alone. One of the things that you could do for them this week, and by the way, in doing it for them, you're going to do something for yourself, is pick up the phone and give them a call, or send them a card, or bake them a cake, or go grab some coffee with them, because it's not good for them to be alone. You will bless them. You will be blessed by them. And you will never have to be afraid of being alone.